Welcome to VSOW, the Deep Dive. We are here to give you those essential insights, really cutting through the noise, the huge stack of information, defining our current political and cultural moment.
And today's deep dive, it feels particularly critical. We're really undertaking a mission here to diagnose this multi-layered crisis that seems to be facing American democracy.
Right.
This isn't just, looking at poll numbers. It's trying to examine structural failure, this deep psychological hostility, and maybe even a kind of cultural collapse.
Exactly. And our sources today, they form this powerful trio. We've got comprehensive polling data from the Public Religion Research Institute, the PRR report, that gives us really granular detail on voter dynamics, policy preferences, things like that. And we're pairing that with, well, the clinical, sometimes chilling academic analysis from political scientist James Adams. He looks at the escalation of political hostility.
Yes, the effective polarization work.
Precisely. And finally, we're grounding all this analysis in, well, the raw, sometimes hopeful, sometimes desperate public sentiment we found in a really revealing grassroots discussion about, the future national ethos. What story are we telling ourselves?
So the mission then, it feels pretty clear. Synthesize these sources, unpack what's fundamentally driving this deep political structural anxiety across the country right now. We need to move beyond just saying, oh, we're divided.
Yeah.
We need to understand the specific mechanisms, the gears grinding underneath that discontent.
Okay, so let's lay out the roadmap for you. We'll start with the public pessimism, that pervasive feeling revealed in the PRRI data. We'll analyze where it's coming from, why it's so intense in certain groups. Then we'll get into the very real operational problems, voting mechanics, systemic issues that, feed into public distrust.
Then from there, we kind of zoom out to the deeper psychological roots of this hyperpartisanship, what the experts like Adams call effective polarization.
And we'll wrap up by exploring the public search, this urgent attempt to define a replacement for what many perceive as the dead American dream.
A new narrative.
Exactly, a new story. #Tech IceHike. The direction of the country and fundamental partisan splits.
Okay, so starting with that foundational mood of the country, the PRRI report, it reveals a level of pessimism that's truly pervasive. I mean, despite economic numbers that might suggest stability or even growth in some areas,
Right.
nearly 2/3, a full 64% of the American public believe the country is seriously off on the wrong track.
64%. That is just a staggering majority.
Wow.
And the report, it drills down into the timing. When did people start feeling this way? 40% say this feeling, this off-course sense, happened recently, like in the last few years. It reflects a kind of immediate political shock, maybe.
Yeah, a reaction to current events.
But a significant chunk, 24%, believe this decline, this malaise, has been happening for a very long time. That suggests something deeper, right? A persistent underlying issue that goes beyond just the current political cycle.
And what's really striking about this pessimism is how completely, utterly inverted it is depending on which party holds the presidency. It's like a perfect partisan mirror effect.
How so?
Well, look back to 2016 during the previous administration. Republicans, overwhelmingly pessimistic. Over 90% felt the country was on the wrong track.
90%.
Yeah. And nearly half of them said it had been happening for a long time. Deep-seated feeling.
And today, you're saying it's flipped.
Almost perfectly swapped. Now, a large majority of Republicans, 70%, say the country is headed in the right direction, but Democrats, only a tiny 8% agree.
Wow. So 70 versus 8. That data point feels crucial. It suggests that how people feel about the country's direction is almost entirely decoupled from, shared objective facts.
Exactly. It's filtered purely through a partisan lens, centered almost entirely on who controls the White House.
It's more than just disagreement, then. It
Yeah.
sounds like the zero-sum game.
It reflects that mentality, absolutely, where the country's success is defined only by your party's success. If the other side is winning, the country must be failing.
That inability to even perceive a shared national direction, regardless of party, that seems like a hallmark of really intense division.
It is, and this inherent partisan split, it gets dramatically amplified when we look at maybe the most fundamental question facing the nation. Demographic change.
Ah, right. The census projection.
Yeah.
That people of color will constitute the majority. I think the projection was by 2043.
Correct. And the public overall views this trend positively. 64% positive, 31% negative. But the real story, again, is in those fault lines.
Okay, break that down.
Well, 85% of Democrats see it positively. A majority of independents, too, 59%. But Republicans, they're split almost right down the middle.
Yeah.
50% view it negatively, 43% positively.
50% negative. When a change representing the future makeup of the country is seen so differently by one party, it basically turns demography itself into a political battleground, doesn't it?
It elevates it into a deeply political and crucially cultural battleground.
Let's zoom in even further on the white population, because the report highlighted the role of education here, and it was massive.
Yes. You see nearly 69% of college-educated white Americans viewing the demographic change positively.
Okay, almost 70% positive.
But when you look at non-college educated white Americans, they are split right down the middle, 50% positive, but a really significant 44% negative.
Why that split? Why is education such a powerful sorting mechanism on this specific issue?
Well, that specific educational gap suggests a few things. First, college exposure often correlates with higher acceptance of multiculturalism, maybe more global perspectives. That's one theory. Second, and maybe more importantly, the economic instability and perhaps perceived status loss often felt more acutely by non-college educated workers. That can be easily conflated with a narrative of national decline driven by these cultural and demographic shifts.
So they might feel their economic struggle is somehow directly tied to the changing identity of the nation.
It's a potent narrative that connects economic anxiety to cultural change. And the data brings in one final, really crucial identity piece: religion. The sources highlight this profound religious exceptionalism. More than half, 52% of white evangelical Protestants view this demographic shift negatively.
52% negative. That's significantly higher than other groups, right?
Significantly higher than any other major religious or non-religious demographic group looked at.
What does that tell us?
It really emphasizes how central cultural and specifically religious identity is to the apprehension about America's changing identity. For many white evangelical Protestants, the sort of historical narrative of America is deeply intertwined with a specific cultural and religious framework.
So the demographic shift isn't just about population numbers for them.
It's perceived not just as a population change, but as a potential, an existential threat to their historical influence, their cultural centrality. This group's anxiety is clearly a key driver of that overall pessimism, that feeling the country is on the wrong track. #2, challenges in voter participation and mechanics.
Okay, so moving from that abstract anxiety, that feeling of wrong direction, to the operational reality. Let's look at the health of the voting system itself, starting with just participation. The PRRI report looked at voter intent heading into the 2018 midterms.
Right, the midterms before the report.
And it found that roughly half of Americans were absolutely certain to vote, which sounds okay, maybe. Yeah. But that certainty masks these enormous structural gaps.
Enormous is the right word. And those gaps, they dramatically reinforce existing structural inequalities. The generational divide is probably the starkest.
How stark?
Only 28% of young adults, those 18 to 29, were absolutely certain to vote. Just 28%.
Wow.
Contrast that with seniors age 65 and up. A colossal 74% were certain.
74 versus 28. That's a massive democratic skew, isn't it? It ensures policy priorities are perpetually weighted towards the interests of older voters.
It certainly tilts the scales heavily. And beyond age, you also find these sharp racial and educational disparities in engagement.
Tell me about those.
Hispanic Americans showed the lowest certainty, just 31%. Compare that to 56% of white Americans and 52% of black Americans.
Okay, so it's a significant gap there. And the education divide we saw earlier.
It pops up again profoundly among white Americans. 68% of college-educated whites were certain to vote. But non-college whites, only 49%.
Less than half.
Right. That engagement gap based on education among white voters is huge.
So how do we make sense of these patterns? Did the report offer a framework?
It did. To help understand this, they constructed what they called a voter engagement typology, basically categorizing Americans based on their voting habits, and the results are quite telling. The 34% of Americans identified as consistent voters, the people who always show up, they are highly partisan. Split pretty evenly, 44% Republican, 39% Democrat.
Okay, the reliable partisans vote. What about others?
Well, conversely, those who identify as independents, they are highly represented among the non-voters. 26% of independents fall into that non-voting category, and only 24% of them are consistent voters.
So the system heavily favors partisan loyalty. It reinforces the power of the two major parties. And independents, the group often seen as the middle ground, are disproportionately well, not participating.
Their lower engagement means they have less influence in shaping outcomes. And this structural reality, it helps explain the deep partisan chasm over what actually constitutes a fundamental problem in the election system itself.
Okay. So people agree there are problems, but not what the problems are.
Well, there's consensus on two major issues. Roughly two-thirds agree that too few people voting is a major problem, 67%. And the disproportionate influence of wealthy individuals and corporations, 66%, see that as a major problem.
Okay, some common ground there.
But consensus rapidly dissolves after that.
And this is where those two competing realities emerge, right?
Precisely. For Democrats, the priorities, the high concerns, center on that wealthy influence we just mentioned. 82% are concerned. Then foreign interference, 68%. And critically, eligible voters being denied the right to vote, disenfranchisement, 56%. See that as a major problem.
Okay, so access, fairness, external influence. What about Republicans?
For Republicans, the priorities are entirely different. They are far more focused on media bias against certain candidates. A huge 81% cite this as a major problem, and people casting ineligible votes. Voter fraud, 52% see that as a major problem.
81% on media bias. That's striking. So it's this fundamental divergence. One side sees a failure of access. The other sees a failure of legitimacy due to bias and fraud.
Exactly.
We really need to pause and think about this difference because it drives basically all the policy debates that follow, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And when the public is forced to choose, what's the ultimate concern? 62% of Democrats say disenfranchisement is the bigger problem, but 68% of Republicans say voter fraud is the greater concern.
How do we interpret that deep structural split in what people fear most about elections?
Well, it's evidence of highly successful political messaging, really. It's created two entirely distinct political narratives about the health of democracy itself. For many Republicans, fueled by years of specific rhetoric, the idea of external corruption, media bias, illegal votes feels like the primary threat.
Okay.
For Democrats, and especially for minority groups, the tangible threat feels internal. It's about systemic barriers, often rooted in history, designed to deny access to eligible voters.
And that focus on disenfranchisement, it's backed up by stark racial disparities in who is concerned about it, right?
Very stark. Only 27% of white Americans cite the denial of voting rights as a major problem. But this concern nearly triples. It rises to 62% among Black and Hispanic Americans.
50 to 62%.
Yeah.
That reflects deeply rooted differences in, lived experience with the voting process, presumably.
And the report provides concrete evidence of exactly those differences in reported voting experiences. Now, overall, the vast majority of Americans don't report major problems when they vote, but
non-white Americans are disproportionately affected when problems do arise.
Exactly. Let's look at some specifics that turn this abstract debate over disenfranchisement into, concrete reality.
Okay.
Black and Hispanic Americans were 3 times more likely than white Americans to report being told they lacked the correct ID. That's 9% each for Black and Hispanic voters versus just 3% for white voters.
3 times more likely. Think about the friction, the potential humiliation in that, multiplied by that frequency.
Right. And difficulty finding the correct polling place. A similar threefold disparity. 15% of Black Americans, 14% of Hispanic Americans reported this issue, compared to only 5% of white Americans.
15%. That's a lot of people potentially struggling just to find where to vote.
And a crucial, very practical barrier, work conflicts. Black and Hispanic Americans, 16% each, were twice as likely as white Americans at 8% to report not being able to get time off work to vote.
16% couldn't get off work. These stats, they really underscore that the barriers to participation aren't random. They disproportionately burden minority voters and, likely, lower-wage workers who have less flexibility.
It paints a very clear picture. The crisis of democracy for many starts right there at the ballot box, where different groups face wildly different degrees of ease and fairness, just trying to exercise this fundamental right. #Tag3, knowledge gaps, and policy preferences.
So this problem of unequal access, it sounds like it's severely compounded by another issue the PRI report highlighted: a widespread lack of basic public knowledge about election laws.
Staggering is the word they used, and I think it fits. It's a core insight.
Yeah.
The operational system itself is just opaque to many people.
Opaque how? What didn't people know?
Well, a majority of Americans are simply not sure about core voting rules. For instance, 60% are unsure if they can vote without a permanent address.
60%.
Yeah. Or 52% are unsure if they can vote even if they're late on their taxes, which generally you can, but people don't know. That's confusion over basic eligibility.
Okay, what else?
These uncertainties extend to really critical and often controversial issues like felony convictions. 43% were unsure about eligibility rules there.
Yeah.
Even fundamental administrative stuff like whether you need to pre-register before Election Day confuses almost a third, 32% of Americans.
What's really surprising, or maybe depressing, is that the report found higher education levels don't necessarily fix this.
That's right. Similar numbers of college-educated and non-college-educated Americans expressed uncertainty about, say, pre-registration requirements.
So it's not just about being uninformed.
It suggests the opaqueness is structural. The rules themselves are often complex, maybe poorly communicated, and they vary so wildly from state to state that even citizens trying to stay informed can't keep up. It's a system designed for confusion almost.
And the report connected this knowledge vacuum directly to actual misperceptions based on where people live, right?
Yes, and this has real consequences. In states that don't have early voting, a massive 44% of residents incorrectly believed they could vote early.
44% thought they could vote early when they couldn't. So they might miss the window entirely.
Exactly. They show up early, get turned away, maybe don't come back on Election Day. Conversely, in states that do allow same-day registration,
Let me guess, people didn't know they could.
you got it, 37% incorrectly believed it was not allowed. So eligible voters are potentially being prevented from registering and casting a ballot simply because they don't know the rules in their own state.
Yeah.
This confusion is a huge self-inflicted barrier to engagement.
Okay, so there's this massive knowledge vacuum about the current, often confusing laws, but despite that, the public actually shows broad support for policies designed to expand voting access. That seems like a crucial distinction.
It really is. People may not know the messy details of the status quo, but they seem to know they want it to be simpler, easier.
Give me some examples.
Okay, take the issue of restoring voting rights for individuals with felony convictions. Overall, 72% agree that rights should be restored after the sentence is served.
72%. That's broad agreement. Does it hold across parties?
It does. 82% of Democrats agree, and a substantial 64% of Republicans also agree. Now, there's an intensity gap Democrats feel more strongly.
How strong?
51% of Democrats completely agree versus 28% of Republicans who completely agree. But still, majority support from both sides is undeniable.
Okay, what about making registration easier?
We see similar bipartisan backing for automatic voter registration, AVR. That's registering citizens automatically when they interact with state agencies like the DMV. Two-thirds of Americans, 67% overall, support this,
Including
83% of Democrats, and notably, a solid majority of Republicans, 52%.
Wow, okay. Even over half of Republicans support AVR. What about same-day registration?
Also enjoys majority support, 61% overall, though this one shows a wider partisan split. 74% of Democrats support it versus 42% of Republicans.
Still, 61% overall. The data seems to signal this clear public appetite for common-sense policies that streamline voting, right? Despite all the political rhetoric framing these changes as somehow nefarious.
Exactly. The public broadly seems to want a system that works better, is more accessible, even if their representatives are fighting tooth and nail over the mechanisms.
And finally, on the mechanics, let's touch on the big one. How we elect the president, the Electoral College versus the popular vote.
Right. There's a strong, clear preference here. 2-to-1. 65% favor using the national popular vote over the Electoral College.
65%. Is that support widespread?
Very high among Black Americans. 85% favor the popular vote. Democrats, 81%. But significantly, nearly half of Republicans, 46%, also favor moving to a popular vote system.
Almost half of Republicans. That reinforces the pattern, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Operationally, the American public seems to lean towards systems that feel more direct, more egalitarian, less restrictive.
It does. The discussion then shifts a bit to localized disparities, which the report highlighted with a case study of the Great Lakes states. Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin.
Critical region politically.
Yeah.
Often decides elections.
Absolutely. And the knowledge variance here, it has real consequences. For instance, in Michigan, which at the time of the report didn't have early voting,
Let me guess, people thought they did.
55% of Michigan residents incorrectly believed they could vote before Election Day. Compare that to neighboring states like Minnesota or Illinois, where early voting is allowed, and residents were correct about the rules at much higher rates, 71 to 75%.
That one misperception in Michigan, believing you can vote early when you can't,
Yeah.
that could cost thousands of votes if people miss the real election day.
Precisely. Furthermore, those racial disparities and voting problems we saw nationally, they were particularly acute in Illinois and Michigan, according to the report. Non-white residents there were significantly more likely than white residents to report operational issues.
Like what?
Things like missing the registration deadline or critically experiencing harassment at the polls.
Harassment.
Yes. So the challenge in these crucial swing states isn't just apathy or confusion. It's navigating a system that can be opaque, confusing, and sometimes, for some groups, actively hostile.
Okay, so we've established these operational failures, the unequal access, the knowledge gaps, and the widespread anxiety about the country's direction. Now we need to move to what feels like the psychological core of the crisis, affective polarization. Let's unpack this term. It gets thrown around a lot. What exactly is affective polarization, and how does the political scientist James Adams differentiate it from just, normal political disagreement?
Right. It's a crucial distinction. Affective polarization isn't just about disagreeing on policy. In the past, Democrats and Republicans could disagree strongly on tax rates or government spending disagreements over fundamentally who gets what.
Okay.
Affective polarization, however, is different. It's a psychological state. It encompasses deep anger, distrust, contempt, hostility, even hatred across party lines. It's less about debating ideas and more about genuinely hating the people on the other side.
Adams describes it as moving beyond just political opposition to a state of sort of moral condemnation.
Exactly. And this is where his findings get really shocking. He found that nearly half of people from both parties agreed with statements suggesting the opposition isn't just wrong in their policies, but that they are actually evil.
Evil. That shifts the entire contest, doesn't it? From a competition of ideas to this deeply personalized moral crusade against perceived enemies.
That's the key distinction. It's not simply dislike anymore. It's often a desire to see the political, social, even the personal failure of the opposing group. And we see this reflected in historical data, too, using the established feeling thermometer scale.
The feeling thermometer, how warm or cold you feel towards different groups.
Precisely. And the scores people give for the opposing political party. They are the lowest they have been in the nearly 50 years since that measure began. The level of sheer toxicity is at a historical peak defining our current era.
So Adams and his colleagues, they looked at this globally, right? Comparing the U.S. against other Western democracies, I think it was 19 of them between 96 and 2017.
That's right.
Was the U.S. truly an outlier in this hostility? Are we uniquely polarized in this affective sense?
The results were, well, nuanced, but definitely concerning. The U.S. ranked 8th out of those 19 in overall affective polarization. So we aren't the absolute most polarized nation on that measure.
Okay, 8th isn't number one, but...
But where the U.S. really stood out was in the intensity of personal hatred. We ranked 4th highest in opposition party dislike. And crucially, the trajectory in the U.S. is steeper than in nearly all peer nations. Meaning affective polarization has intensified more sharply here in the U.S. since the mid-1990s than in most comparable countries. And it's driven specifically by this visceral, growing personal dislike of the other side.
Okay, so why? Why is the U.S. trajectory so steep? What are the root causes that Adams' comparative research identified as fueling this specific escalation of hostility here?
His analysis pointed to two major systemic factors that tend to correlate with higher hostility globally. First, winner-take-all voting systems.
Like ours.
Like ours. They tend to breed higher hostility because there's no built-in mechanism forcing compromise. Every election feels like an existential zero-sum battle. Win or lose, everything.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second factor?
Second, countries with large gaps between the rich and the poor, high income inequality, also show higher levels of division and hostility.
And the U.S. ranks high there, doesn't it? I think you mentioned the Gianni Index earlier.
We do. The U.S. ranks 4th globally among high-income countries on the Gianni Index, which measures inequality. 0 is perfect equality, 1 is maximum inequality. Our high ranking indicates our substantial wealth gap is a major contributing factor to social and political instability. People feeling left behind are naturally more susceptible to polarizing narratives.
Okay, so winner-take-all system, high inequality. But here's where it gets really interesting. Connecting back to the culture wars we discussed earlier, Adams found that the most significant driver in the U.S.'s particularly sharp rise in hostility wasn't just the economics, it was cultural debates.
Yes, the cultural amplifier seems to be key in the American context. Debates centered on identity, things like immigration, LGBTQ rights, abortion, these seem to be the primary fuel for our specific crisis.
Why are those different?
Adams draws the sharp distinction. Economic debates are fundamentally about who gets what. And while heated, they often allow for compromise. You can split the difference, right? Agree to a 1% tax increase instead of 5%.
Okay.
Cultural debates, however, are fundamentally about who we are. They're about identity, morality, deeply held beliefs about the nature of society, family, life itself.
So if you're negotiating a budget, maybe you compromise.
Yeah.
But if you feel you're negotiating a core religious belief or the definition of your community, compromise feels like surrender,
Yeah.
like betrayal.
Exactly. When the political conversation becomes saturated with these moral identity issues, compromise is often perceived as impossible, even immoral. You can't negotiate half of your identity, right? This leads directly back to that feeling that the opposition isn't just wrong on policy, but they're evil because they seem to threaten the very core essence of your community, your identity, your way of life, your future existence.
So if this extreme psychological polarization, this affective polarization, is reaching these unprecedented levels, how does it typically resolve? Does Adams's research offer any historical clues, any comparative hope for how societies pull back from this kind of brink?
Well, unfortunately, the sheer intensity of this specific strain of affective polarization, especially fueled by identity politics in the modern media age, is historically quite recent. So we lack sufficient long-term data to definitively say, here's the standard off-ramp.
Okay, so no easy answer.
No easy answers. However, Adams's comparative research did find two robust political circumstances that are strongly associated with reduced hostility in other democracies. Some hopeful signs.
Okay, what are those specific findings? What seems to help lower the temperature?
The first is mandatory inter-party cooperation, specifically coalition governments. A study analyzing those 19 countries found that when political parties were compelled to share government power, even when they intensely disliked each other, it actually reduced hostility, not just among elites, but in the broader society.
Really, just forcing them to work together helps.
Apparently so. And critically, that improvement, that reduction in hostility, it lingered for years even after the coalition government dissolved. The act of cooperation, even when forced, seems to act as a kind of psychological bomb on the society.
That is a profound finding. The act itself changes the public mood. What was the second factor?
The second factor was gender representation. Quite simply, a higher number of women in government is consistently associated with lower levels of partisan hostility, both in the legislature and in society overall.
Interesting. So the path back from this kind of moral-driven hostility, it seems to involve systemic changes, things that mandate cooperation and maybe promote more diverse, perhaps less aggressive leadership styles.
Right. And if Adams showed us that the U.S. is sort of psychologically boiling over because we can't agree on who we are, then our final source, that grassroots Reddit discussion, tries to answer what happens next. What happens when the underlying national narrative, the American dream itself, just seems to collapse under the strain of all that hostility and inequality?
Yeah, the premise of that Reddit thread was really powerful. The core idea was the old story, work hard, move up, get on top, make it, is dead for most people. It's left them feeling burned out, isolated, like the system just rewards privilege, not effort.
Mm-hmm.
And they were actively searching for a replacement, a new collective mission statement. They sort of playfully termed it version number 0.1.
And this diagnosis, this feeling, it connects directly back to the economic disparities, the Gini index we talked about, and the political anxieties from the PRRI report. Commenters explicitly cited that kind of historical, cyclical nature of civilization decline that historians sometimes talk about.
What cycle is that?
Security leads to prosperity, which leads to greed, then hoarding, which causes social stratification, and finally strife. The general consensus in that thread was that the U.S. is firmly locked in the greed and hoarding phase.
Greed and hoarding. And that economic inequality, it's amplified now, isn't it?
Right.
By modern tech, by social media.
Massively amplified. The feeling of deprivation is always relative, historically. The visible wealth gap often mattered more psychologically than one's objective standard of living.
Right.
Today, modern communication tools, especially social media, they exacerbate this dramatically. They make people feel acutely miserable based on the constant contrast, the jealousy of seeing elite success or hoarding constantly displayed, regardless of their own actual capacity to, put food on the table. The visible gap, constantly in your face, is the psychological killer.
So the structural diagnosis from that thread, what was the core problem identified?
The core problem was identified as essentially an oligarchy, A small elite could be political, financial, corporate, doesn't matter, operating with the same mentality of control and entitlement. This elite is richer than ever, and crucially, they possess far superior tools now for control, for propaganda, for surveillance, which leads to this rapid and painful fracturing of society we're seeing.
Okay, so if that old story, the hyper-individualistic get-on-top story, is dead or dying, what are the characteristics of this new, potentially unifying story, this version point 1 that people were debating? What do they propose?
Well, the proposed alternatives consistently focused on shared collective repair rather than that old zero-sum competition.
Okay, like what?
One major category involved social and economic repair, often using terms like social democracy or even socialism, but trying to redefine it.
How did they define socialism?
They argued for re-educating people on the term, defining it not necessarily as state control of everything, but as cooperation organized around meeting basic human needs. Practically, they proposed adapting models maybe closer to European social democracies.
What would that include?
Things like mandatory profit sharing for all employees in large companies, hard wealth caps to prevent the establishment of, like, a permanent plutocracy, and significantly, universal basic income, UBI.
UBI comes up a lot in these future-focused discussions.
Yeah.
Let's elaborate on that for a second. What does having a UBI fundamentally change in a person's daily life compared to just having a standard minimum wage job, assuming they can find one?
Well, fundamentally, UBI aims to remove the scarcity panic, the constant economic anxiety. For a low-wage worker today, the calculation is often, I must take this job, any job, regardless of dignity or pay, because I need to survive.
Right, the desperation.
With UBI providing a basic floor, the worker's calculation potentially changes to, my basic needs are met, now I have the leverage to demand better conditions or maybe pursue education or contribute to my community in other ways. It shifts the power dynamic away from total employer control based on fear towards a baseline of human dignity. It gives people capacity.
Capacity to care, maybe, beyond just immediate survival. Okay, so that's the socioeconomic repair vision. What else emerged?
A second really powerful future narrative that came up was the solar punk or eco-punk ethos. This moves beyond just pure economics into environmental concerns and, importantly, communal living.
Solar punk. Okay, paint a picture. What does that look like?
It's often envisioned as a kind of high-tech but decentralized green socialism. It focuses heavily on communal progress, local resilience. The key visuals are often things like self-sufficiency, building perennial food forests and shared public spaces, urban farming, even literally taking down the physical fences between suburban backyards to create large, shared common areas.
Taking down fences. That's a potent symbol. What's the core idea behind that?
The core idea is a complete reframing of what success even means. The metric of achievement shifts entirely. Success equals the positive impact you create for other people and for the planet, not your personal status or how much wealth you accumulate.
It's an ideological rejection of the get-on-top mentality.
Completely. In favor of something like lift everyone up together.
Okay. Any other major visions?
And finally, there was the abundance mindset narrative. This one is more purely technological, but it requires maybe the biggest cultural pivot of all.
The Star Trek ideal, basically.
Pretty much. It relies on rapid technological advancement, think AI, fusion energy, nanotech, advanced life sciences, to create truly abundant resources. If energy becomes virtually free, if housing can be 3D printed cheaply, if major diseases are cured, the entire economic basis of society shifts.
So the promise of abundance is that it annihilates the foundation of scarcity that drives all the current zero-sum competition, the hoarding, the hostility we've been talking about.
That's the theory. But for this to work, society would first have to culturally unlearn scarcity, which is a deeply ingrained mindset, right? And embrace a system where there's genuinely enough to go around, maybe supported by things like a really progressive tax code to build a safety net, especially against automation potentially displacing jobs.
So across all these different proposals, social democracy, solar punk, abundance, the recurring theme seems to be this urgent need to transition, to move away from an unsustainable, hyper-competitive, sort of frontier-based ideology.
Right, an ideology that always deferred solving social problems by just assuming you could move to new land, new resources.
And move towards one centered on communal resilience, maybe mandatory cooperation, shared human dignity.
Yeah.
It feels like the public, or at least this segment of it, is signaling that the cultural story has to change before the political system can ever be fixed. Hashtag TaxEdsFronts.
Okay, let's try and pull these threads together. The sources we've looked at today, they really paint this picture of simultaneous crises, don't they?
They really do. We have operational failure, The voter knowledge gaps, the unequal access to the ballot box, we have this deep psychological decay, that effective polarization escalating into moral condemnation, seeing the other side as evil,
Hmm.
and then underneath it all, this profound cultural void, the collapse of the traditional American dream narrative, leaving people searching for a new story.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is the collision between that academic finding from Adams that cooperation, even forced cooperation, reduces hostility, and the public sentiment we saw in the Reddit thread, which suggests our current core story is still one of aggressive individualism, hoarding, and zero-sum competition.
Yeah, those seem fundamentally opposed, which raises a really important question, doesn't it? Can a country so steeped in an ideology of hyper-individualized, winning that frontier mindset you mentioned, that historically deferred solving social problems through expansion, can it ever genuinely pivot?
Can it pivot towards the collective, repair-focused narrative that so many people in that discussion, and arguably the data on polarization, suggest is necessary for long-term survival? Or is the toxicity, the individualistic programming, just too ingrained?
The fate of U.S. democracy, it seems to rest on whether these systemic, psychological, and cultural failures can somehow be addressed simultaneously rather than, one after the other.
It feels like they're all interconnected.
Absolutely. And we saw from Adams that what fuels the U.S. crisis most intensely is fundamentally cultural, that inability to compromise on who we are. If cultural debates are the root of our polarization, and we know that cooperation seems to be a key to cooling the hostility, then we have to think about the mechanisms for cultural change.
Where does that change come from?
Right. If the current stories we tell ourselves, whether it's through mainstream media, maybe organized religion, even Hollywood blockbusters, if they're primarily reinforcing individualism or conflict, what national cultural institution, if any, is best positioned to maybe shift its narrative, to foster respect, shared identity, maybe even mandatory cooperation instead of conflict over the next, say, 50 years? That's something for you, our listeners, to think about.
A challenging thought. And if this deep dive today helped you gain some clarity on these really complex, interlocking issues, please do remember to subscribe, like, and maybe comment with your own thoughts, especially on those future narratives we discussed. What's your version point one of a new unifying American story look like? Your engagement genuinely helps us keep these conversations going.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.